Welcome everyone. I hope you can hear me loud and clear. So we're doing our monthly live stream question and answer. There's been a little bit of a change in the time, and that's because we're doing classes every Saturday morning with the preliminaries. So for the meantime, it's going to be at 11 Pacific time. Crystal clear, says snow, so that's good. Now, we've had several questions previously about Dakini's hair, and also Paul asked about this, some clarification. It's quite a complicated topic, and there isn't a lot of specific information that comes from the text. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about this, and specifically in relationship to the black crown. And I think that's primarily where people hear about this. So, as I said previously, then my own teacher, when he talks about the Dakinis and the Yidams, etc., he talks about it in a specific Vajrayana tantric presentation. And so you need to understand a little bit about that, right? Now we've talked about the various different tantric types of tantric practices, and we have inner tantras and outer tantras, and we have primarily we have these kind of four tantras we talk about. So we talk about the Kriya, right, Charya Yoga, and highest yoga. And most people haven't really experienced tantric teachings in the Hindu tradition, so a lot of Hindu people think that the Kriya Tantra is the highest Tantra, and that's because they do Kundalini Yoga, but it's actually the lowest form of Tantra. It's primarily associated with outer aspects. So when I'm saying that, so you can understand a little bit about my own teacher's presentation of what a Dakini is, or for example, what the channels, winds and drops, these chakras, etc. are. So in the highest Yoga Tantra, then what it teaches is, like I've said before, then lower tantras, you kind of see the deities as being separate, right? And when you talk about the three yogas, then you've got the Ma, Anu, and Ati Yoga. And in the Ma Yoga, then you're kind of seeing the deity as being like a king or something separate to you. And usually the deities are visualized in front on top. When you've got the Anu Yoga, then you are visualizing the deity and yourself as being kind of like equals, like the practitioner of the deity is equal. And then when you sort of Ati Yoga, then you're thinking about being inseparable. So this is kind of related to the non-dual Vedic practices, Advaita Vedanta. It's similar, right? In the lower schools of the Hindu practice, then they do a lot of devotional practice related to worship of God. And then in the yogic practices, they try to unite the Atman and the Brahman, right? We've all heard about this, and because primordially they're equal, and we try to, through our practices, to find reunification with the Brahman, which is like God. And in the non-dual practice, then we say there is no separation between these. So it's kind of similar, right? And so in the Vajrayana practice, the highest Yoga Tantra practices, then this is associated with the views of the consciousness-only school and upwards. So you might have heard of the Chittamatra, excuse me. So there's consciousness-only school, and there it said that basically outer phenomena don't have a separate existence, but everything is a manifestation of mind. And then the middle way schools take that a step further, and they also say that ultimately mind has no substantial existence, but it still has this idea that everything is a manifestation of consciousness. And in the Tantric or Vajrayana practices, then we do various yogas. And in these yogas, then what we have are, we have this conceptual idea of the body being filled with various nadis or channels, and these chakras that exist at the various different places. For example, we've got the head chakra, throat chakra, heart chakra, the navel chakra, and the secret place chakra. And specifically what it says in the Anuttara Yoga practices is that the outer world we experience is a manifestation of these kind of 21 sacred places in the body. So there's 21 sacred places in the body, and they manifest as 21 sacred places in the external world. For example, Dorji Den, where the Buddha became enlightened, is one of these places. And so what we see here is that this map, this system of chakras and channels, etc., within the body reflects upon the outer world and creates the appearing world that we experience. This is really important. And so in this presentation, then what my teacher is saying is that, for example, Dakinis are manifestations of mind, particularly their type of mental events, right? So they are, somebody asked, Snowmaster asked, are these places different for different people? The actual locations of the chakras are not different. So the chakras have specific characteristics. They have numbers of petals, they have numbers of interconnecting channels, and in the Tibetan version of Kundalini Yoga, which is essentially was the same thing 1,000 years ago, it's just that the Hindu Kundalini Yoga has lost a lot of detail because of all the scriptural references have been lost, but they were preserved intact fully in Tibet. It explains in great detail about all these channels, super detailed, and you have to like visualize all of it. I won't go into it because that's a secret practice, but it's so incredibly detailed that it's mind-blowing. And really most people don't go into much detail when they do these yogic practices, but we were fortunate because my teacher had a huge, vast store of information on the practices, and so we had detailed maps of all the chakras, how the petals were shaped and everything like that. So, but these are, you have to understand, these are conventional or provisional. These are roadmaps, right? They're signs or symbols pointing at something else. So Snow is asking, are these channels and things different? They're not different. What is different is whether or not the winds that pass through the channels are pure or impure. So what we have is the ordinary world, and we experience the ordinary world because our winds that flow through the channels in the bodies are unpurified, and then we experience delusion. This is the Vajrayana presentation. And then when those winds are purified, they move into the central channel, and that is what is the cause for enlightenment. So we've got the right channel, left channel, which are the sun and the moon channels respectively, and we have the central and the Uma channel that runs through the center of the body up to the Ushnisha, which is the crown of the head. And what we have is something called the pineal gland that sits in the center of the brain between the eyebrows. So in an ordinary being, if you look from the side, then this channel is hooked over and it comes forward to the middle of the eyes. And that's where we kind of perceive an external world as being real. For Buddha, as all of the winds move into the central channel and are purified, then this tip of the central channel raises up to the crown of the head. And that's why Buddhas have this crown protuberance. They have this lump on top of their head, right? And so what the yoga practitioner does is to physically, either through the yogas or through their meditation, is to move the winds into the central channel, and then they all rise up to the top, and through the practice then you elevate your central channel so it's straight again and like an arrow, and that's why we have this yogic posture where we sit very straight as well. So now what you have to understand is that essentially what are Dakinis are these purified thoughts. So my teacher talks about Dakinis as if they're the kind of energy or the movement of thought, especially thought that is purified. So let's look at the case of a yoga practitioner, and that is Padmasambhava. So the greatest yoga practitioner, Guru Rinpoche, Padmasambhava. And he's often visualized with this huge retinue of Dakinis. So here we're thinking, okay, now we get an idea what a Dakini is. And most people think, wow, it's like some cool kind of harem. He has all these girlfriends, and he enters into union with them. And so this conceptually is that's what people think about. When they think about tantric practice, they think it's some kind of like orgy or something like that. It's not like that. So in this context, what we understand is that the Dakinis themselves, what they represent is like the wisdom aspect of mind. So that means purified thoughts. So conventionally, in lower tantras and lower yogic practices, we see thought as being something we need to get rid of, right? We sit and practice. There's various different techniques in order to eliminate thought. That is not the way that a Vajrayana or Mahamudra practitioner will talk. Thoughts are not what need to be. So I'm getting distracted by people's comments. Arthur is being very rude. So what we normally do is we think we need to get rid of thoughts. But in the Vajrayana, we say we don't need to get rid of thoughts. Thoughts themselves, and kleshas even, or themselves are wisdom and they're pure. We just don't recognize that. So this is what is the notion of purification of this. So conceptually, we think of this yogi being Guru Rinpoche, and that yoga Guru Rinpoche engages in consort practice, and by doing this, then he achieves enlightenment or manifests appearances. Okay, so essentially, there's many different types of consorts. Some of them are worldly beings. Some of them are Dakinis. They're worldly Dakinis. They're also sort of like wisdom Dakinis. There's different types of Dakinis, but essentially, in context of this question, what is the hair of the Dakini, then these are wisdom Dakinis, and they are themselves this potential of wisdom mind. So we see appearances as being something we want to get rid of, right? In lower practices, we want to eliminate thought and just rest in stillness, etc. But in the Vajrayana, what we understand is that the thoughts themselves are pure. So it's this recognition of appearances and the various different colors and flavors of appearance and experience as being wisdom mind itself. And that's what these wisdom Dakinis are. So when you see Padmasambhava with this great retinue of all these different Dakinis, him entering into union with one of his consorts is not about him, like I say, having some kind of orgy or something like that. What it's doing is it's recognition or the natural union of appearance emptiness. And its appearance, as we know, appearances are limitless. So there's two types of wisdom. There's understanding the nature of phenomena, how things are, and then understanding the manifestations of phenomena. And appearance is related to the manifestation aspect. So even anger, desire, pride, different complex thoughts are all expressions of wisdom mind. So the term in Tibetan is rolpa. Rolpa means to play. So you hear this play of manifestation that's talked about in the Nyingma tradition. What this play of manifestation is the various different appearances of mind. And the yogi does not separate appearance and emptiness and remains in union. It's the same as not separating the Atman and the Brahman. It's not seeing there to be, it's basically going beyond duality. This is important about this aspect of going beyond duality or non-duality. Okay, so bear that in mind because it's coming up. This is a complicated topic, so you have to bear with me. You know, it's a deep dive. We're doing our best to cover all the bases. So we've got Guru Rinpoche. His yogic practice is for the mind to remain in the union of appearance emptiness. And as we know, appearances are infinite. Anything can appear to mind. There's this great, vast richness of appearances. And when they are ordinary, then they are like demons, and when we're recognized to be pure, they are Dakinis. And so that's the symbology, and that's in terms of actual yogic or tantric practices what they are. But conceptually, they look like all these wild kind of sky-going, flying heroes and heroines, etc. So the Dakinis, then, they're symbolized as their bodies are very supple, and they're often in these very energetic postures, and they have long flowing hair. Sometimes the hair is like on fire, etc. So this symbology that comes from the tankas, the paintings, is showing that these Dakinis symbolize wisdom, but the energetic aspect of wisdom, the way that it plays or manifests. That's why you see them dancing kind of. There's these kind of dance forms that were associated with the Indian Vedic tradition. There's these very different postures we talk about, and in the tantric practices we go into detail about these different postures. But these postures, what they're symbolizing is the great manifestations or the play of mind, the ability of mind to create anything, and also how anything that appears to mind is pure. Okay, so now you're getting an understanding that a Dakini is a manifestation of mind, and it is a manifestation of mind that recognizes wisdom. So it recognizes that all appearances are not separate from emptiness. So there's these aspects. There's this wisdom aspect, which is emptiness itself. So they're not something substantial or real. They're not like gods. They're not like angels who are real, right? And then there's this manifestation aspect. And in English, we talk about like energy all the time. They don't talk about energy in the scriptures. There's soak, which is life force. That's different. But they don't talk about energy. But what they talk about is this playful or this enjoyment aspect. Enjoyment aspect is we think of enjoyment, it's the same term that's used for sexual enjoyment, and so it's associated with the union practices. But again, remember the conceptually, the union aspect is just an illustration, right? It's a metaphor. What that is that it's natural engaging in the appearances that arise to mind without discrimination, etc., without self-identification. So let's look at the history of the Dakinis here and where most people come to understand this. And that is the story of Dusun Khenpa. And so we've got this knower of the 3 times, the first Karmapa. Who is that? Well, that was a yogic practitioner, and he was what we see as being the founder of our lineage, the Karmapa. The Karmapa is said to be a manifestation or a reincarnation of Saraha. Saraha was the Indian yogi who basically brought us the teachings, the first person to bring us the teachings on the Mahamudra. And I guess the earliest references are somewhere around the 5th or 6th century AD, that kind of time period. So Karmapa is said to have been a reincarnation of this individual, and it's the same Karmapa who continues to be reincarnated. And at some point, then the Karmapa achieved the 8th Bhumi. So that's the 8th Bodhisattva level. You see, the more we talk about these things, the more complex it gets, the more detail we have to go into, the more we have to unpick, and this kind of deep dive on what is a Dakini and what is a Dakini's hair. Now, why is it significant? Why does it say that it's the 8th level? So at the 8th level, then the Dakinis appeared to Karmapa Dusun Khenpa. He wasn't a Karmapa then, right? He was Dusun Khenpa. That was his name. He was a yogic practitioner. The Dakinis appeared to him and bestowed upon him a crown made out of their hair. So this is where we get the idea of Dakini's hair. And this is also associated with the some of the questions, like somebody asked in the question, somebody asked, does this crown still exist? Where is it, for example? So first thing you have to understand is that this crown cannot exist materially as a thing. This crown is a kind of manifestation of enlightened mind. Why is it significant? Because the Karmapa achieved the 8th Bhumi. Now, I've said this before, so maybe you'll remember. The 8th, 9th, and 10th Bhumis are said to be the pure levels. The pure levels are when all notions of duality are eliminated. So these cognitive obscurations that cause individuals to identify with reality are completely eliminated. And it is a far more subtle level than anything we could imagine. It's got nothing to do with the way we conceptually understand non-duality that people talk about all the time on YouTube. Somebody who has even achieved the first Bodhisattva Bhumi, who has not purified all their duality, then their realization, their mind is beyond anything we could conceive. It's totally inconceivable to us. Right? So it's not just a simple matter of thinking, well, everything I experience is just a process in my brain, therefore there's non-duality. It's got nothing to do with that. It's a very high level of realization. So the Karmapa achieved this 8th Bhumi, and then is when it's said that these Dakinis bestowed upon him this conceptual crown. And this crown is like a fractal manifestation of enlightened mind. It's basically on the pure levels, you've completely unlocked the power of consciousness to the point where you no longer conceive a phenomena in a conceptual way. It's what is called beyond the 8 elaborations. So that is tapping in to the fundamental nature of reality, which is a persistent, it's very difficult because when you get into this kind of language at this point, you start to sound like you're talking about something theistic. For example, there's these things that we deny, sang, dak, tak, right? This purity, permanence, right? Cleanliness, right? These sort of things. Self, ultimate self. So in the Hindu tradition, they talk about this ultimate self, this ultimate being, or this Brahman, which is everything. It's permanent, it's pure. These are all refuted in the Buddha Dharma. But when you get up to this level of trying to discuss exactly what is real non-duality, then you start to use language that sounds very similar. But there's a difference. If you look at the way the language is structured, it's called sublime self, sublime purity, sublime permanence, etc. Right? So provisionally we have to use this kind of language. because there is nothing that persists. However, the true or authentic reality is this non-dual state that the Karmapa on the 8th level came to realize, became an 8th level bodhisattva. And so we have to talk about it in some way. And what we say is that like 100,000 Dakinis manifest and then wove a crown out of their hair. And their hair is associated with these qualities of wisdom, energy, transcendence. What is transcendence? Transcendence is transcendence from the mundane existence. Now, we achieve a level of transcendence on the first Bodhisattva Bhumi. That's when you become liberated from samsara. It means you no longer suffer. But there is another transcendence, and that's transcendence from all duality, and that happens on the 8th level. So then, from that point onwards, then this being who is reincarnated from lifetime to lifetime, then was adorned with this sign of becoming a Vajradhara, which is like Dorje Chang, having achieved this level that Milarepa, for example, achieved. Also Milarepa in his own enlightenment, and at some point he's visited by Dakinis. And what it means is that all appearances have been recognized in the true state, and that person has gone beyond all cognitive obscurations. And the sign of this is the manifestation of their enlightened mind, which is resting in total non-elaboration, which is called true non-duality. And so this is these kind of infinite fractal manifestations of consciousness, or the appearing aspect that we identify as things, stuff that we relate to, right? But for somebody who has gone beyond duality completely, then it's a different experience. It's not an experience we can even talk about, let alone come even close to understanding. It's not like if I take a hero's dose of mushrooms and I trip out for the evening, we think, wow, that must have been, those are just mundane experiences. Those are completely mundane experiences that we don't understand. We get some kind of feeling or inspiration from that practice, and it can help you progress on the path. I'm not saying that there isn't any use in that. It can be useful, but it's not what we call this tapping into the fractal manifestations of the cosmos, which would be equivalent to residing in the singularity at the beginning of time. But it doesn't actually happen at the beginning of time. That singularity at the beginning of time is persistent in as much as time has not begun yet. And time does not exist in that context, and so it is permanent in that context. But it's not something that exists within the framework of time, so it cannot be spoken about in terms of permanence. So anyway, really difficult, right? Because we talk about this freedom from these extremes of being existent, non-existent, both existent, non-existent, neither existent nor non-existent. We talk about freedom from the elaborations, which means free of conception or objectivization of being born, ceasing, coming, going, singularity, plurality, sameness, and difference. Really difficult topic. So the Karmapa, Dusum Khenpo we're talking about, the first Karmapa, then was given this crown, which is just a mark of enlightenment. So it's a manifestation, complete opening up of consciousness and tapping into the authentic reality, nature of reality, where you become inseparable with that. It's kind of pretty much the same as being a Buddha, but there's a slight difference between somebody residing on the pure levels and what we call a Tathagata. Tathagata, it even says that a Tathagata is inconceivable to the minds of somebody on the pure levels. So we just see how difficult it is. And then, so somebody with realization then could see this crown. It's not a physical thing, right? So somebody said, does this crown still exist? It never existed, right? Existence is denied in the higher levels of Buddha Dharma. Both the extremes of existence and non-existence are completely denied. They're refuted. They don't make sense, right? Does something exist? The notion of does something exist doesn't make sense in terms of somebody who has realization. But the signs of their achievement or enlightenment are manifest. And they manifest in the conception in the form of a crown. So typically then the Karmapas were teachers, spiritual advisors to the Mongol emperors and the Ming Dynasty emperors. And there's this fifth Karmapa. I think this is around the early 15th century. So it's a lot later, right? Way after. Hundreds of years after. 500 years after, then, or 400 years after, then Deshin Shekpa, which was the fifth Karmapa, went to the Ming Emperor at that time. And the Emperor of, I think Yongli is the name of the Emperor at that time. Then the Emperor had a really high level of meditation. And many of these emperors did, because they had great luxury to practice, and they had, as spiritual advisors, they had these leaders of, entire lineages would teach them. And he could see this crown above the head of Deshin Shepa. Whatever that actually was, it's a sign of enlightenment, whatever it was, then he could perceive the Deshin Shepa's level of realization. And because of that, then he commissioned a crown to be made. And this is the crown that then was used within our lineage, which is a representation. And it's said to be imbued with all the powers and the blessing of the real crown. What is the power and the blessing of the real crown? Well, that's the manifestation, or the unlocked mind, or the level of realization of the Karmapa. It's what we call the Dharma. And when we say the Dharma, there's the Dharma that we write down in scriptures. There's the Dharma that is logic, words, sentences, even images. But there is the Dharma that resides in the mind of a realized being. And what that crown is a sign of the Dharma that resides in the mind of the being. And the Dakini's hair is this kind of these interconnected. We can think about it as neural links. If you think about the brain as being these nodes, these neural nodes, and they're connected with all these fibers, then the Dakinis are like that in terms of conceptually, as that they are all the various interconnections between apparent phenomena that does not exist in reality. So in terms of singularity, then it doesn't make sense to talk about things existing independently, but the way they manifest to us is through interdependent connections. That's why it's said that all phenomena are empty, because they are interdependent, but they appear also because they are interdependent. This is the presentation from Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna states that things appear to us only because they are interdependent. So these are these fractal connections, neural connections that make things appear in terms of time, space, etc., relevance, and manifestation. But because they are only a formation based on interdependent connections, then they do not have any substantial reality. And this is this interweaving of these kind of, like you could say, channels, these fractal manifestations of this Dakini energy, then that produces this sign, this mark of an enlightened being. So this Yongli Emperor, around the beginning of the 15th century, I think, then he commissioned a crown, and it was made, and it has jewels and stuff on it, and I think it's probably made out of yak hair, right? But they say, people say, oh, those are Dakini hairs on there. Well, Dakini hairs don't appear to ordinary beings. They're not a thing, right? They're not a thing that can appear. Like enlightened mind manifests in any way. In fact, all the deities that we experience, Yidams, Buddhas, Dharma protectors, all of these things are manifestations of enlightened mind. But they are also manifestations of your own mind. Like, as it said in the recent class that we were attending, then we've got this all beings possess the Buddha nature. So basically all beings in essence are Buddha. We don't understand that. The point here is that what is the Buddha's mind other than emptiness? And all phenomena being empty are equal to the mind of a Buddha. And on top of that, our experience is only something that manifests from mind. Personally, we can't speak of anything outside of the experience of our own mind. It's impossible. Even if we think about a rock floating in space that has never been seen by any conscious being, that is only a manifestation of mind. That's just an idea, right? So these things being equal. And then this crown has persisted to this day, we think. I mean, it's probably been redone many times. It could be a different crown than the one that was actually made. It's difficult to say. There's not a lot of information. But we see this as being equal to the original crown that was worn by Dusun Khenpa, and it is the crown that was used famously by the 16th Karmapa in the Black Cat ceremony. And it says that sort of through, for example, through enlightened being, through seeing, hearing, touching, or thinking about an enlightened being, then this helps us to become awakened. Now, maybe you've heard these terms before, but do you know what the relevance is? Well, there's a very famous book in the West, which is actually an extract from a much larger compendium of texts, and it's called the Bardo Todro. And the Bardo Todro is what we call the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Okay, suddenly everybody's lighting up. I've heard of that. Well, this Todral means liberation through hearing. So what we have is, this is an extract from the Samadhi Raja Sutra. It says, a bodhisattva with a lion's roar will appear. He will use the power he achieved in deep meditation to benefit countless beings. By seeing, hearing, touching, and thinking of him, they will be led to happiness. They will be led to bliss, maybe is a better translation. And this is said to be a prophecy of the coming of the Dusun Khyentse, the first Karmapa. But it's directly related to this conversation, right? He will use the power he achieved in deep meditation to benefit countless beings. That is him achieving the 8th Bodhisattva Bhumi through his meditative absorption, and by that, then unlocking the limitless power of non-dual mind, which is conceptualized as these Dakinis. And then it said by seeing, hearing, touching, or thinking of him, there is this blessing. There's this ability to become awakening. And the crown is said to be imbued with that ability. So when you do the black hat ceremony, it's all wrapped up in a box. And at some point in the ceremony, then it's unwrapped and the Karmapa raises it up, puts it on their head during the empowerment. And this is said to be a cause for beings to be set on the path to awakening. Now, it sounds like this contradicts what is taught in the Buddha Dharma. For example, the Buddha said, I can only teach you the path to awakening, but you yourself alone must tread that path. Famously, the Buddha said that water cannot wash away your sins. These hands cannot take away your negativity. That's your inherent negativity. And realization is not something that can be transferred from one mind to the other. So how is it that this object has the power to set people on the path? Well, I think I've talked about this recently, but a teacher or a Buddha has a particular ability, and that is to understand the disposition of the students. And on top of understanding the disposition of the students, that enlightened beings also see karma. So remember, there's these kind of infinite web of interconnectivity, which we visualize as like how our brain works, right? And it's also how we visualize kind of physical matter being constructed within some scientific theory. So everything is connected, right? There's this interconnected web, and an enlightened being sees that. And they also see the dispositions of a being. And through knowing that, then what they can do is they can act as a condition for karma to ripen at a particular time. We all have infinite amounts of karma, right? We've had loads of lives, like just countless lives, and we've done all kinds of things. But all that karma doesn't ripen at the same time. There's bad, good, there's neutral, all kinds of stuff. So let's say you meet a Buddha. Buddha like meets you and says, oh, look at this guy, he's got all this kind of karma. Oh, there's some good stuff, there's some bad stuff. And the Buddha thinks, well, if this karma can ripen now, that will help set this person on the path. And that's what a Buddha does. And that's what this interaction like with empowerment does. So there's blessing, but the blessing is based on your own potential and your own disposition. And it's kind of accelerated by the skill of a teacher. Now, significant spiritual teachers are very inspiring, right? And so, and it's because of your faith in that teacher. It's not because they have some magical superpower and they can go zoing, you're enlightened. That's not how it works. Sprinkle water on your head. That's what most Tibetans think. If they go to empowerment, bow their head down low and the Lama will sprinkle them with water, then they'll get enlightened. That's not it. You have this power of faith within you. And that's extremely important in the Vajrayana practice. Generally, we don't see blind faith, etc., devotion to be that important in the Buddha Dharma, and it's only really in the Vajrayana we talk about this kind of guru worship. But when it comes to the Vajrayana practice, tantric practices, if you have this basis of strong faith, it can help propel you on the path. But it has to be associated with, it doesn't necessarily have to be associated with a valid object. You can have faith in a mistaken object, and that can still progress you along the path. It just goes to show that it's all about you. It's not about the external object, right? For example, there's a story of the dog's tooth. So there's this tooth of the dog. There was this merchant from Tibet, and he would travel to India regularly to buy stuff and bring it back to Tibet, because they could bring all this stuff they can't make in Tibet, and they can make lots of money. And so his mother knew he was traveling backwards and forwards to India, and she said, well, she was really devout Buddhist, and she said, well, if you ever come across a relic of the Buddha, please bring one back, because I have such faith. If you bring it back, I'll put it in my altar and I'll practice. Because that's all she wanted to do, right? She had great faith. And he could go, come back, and every time he would forget, or it would be too difficult, right? To hunt down a relic from the Buddha, it's quite difficult. And so one time, he'd been doing this for years, and one time he was coming back and he thought, oh, shit, I forgot Mum again, right? And he was already on the road back to Tibet, and he saw on the side of a road a skeleton of a dog. And he pulled out one of the dog's teeth and he put it in his pocket, and he traveled back. And his mother said, did you get it this time? Did you get it? And very funny icon, Mary. Tooth of a dog. It's not a dog's tooth, though, is it? And then he pulled out this tooth. He said, yes, I found you a relic. I found a tooth of the Buddha. If you look in India, I think in the Delhi Museum, they actually have a series of relics from the Buddha, and one of them's a tooth, I believe. And she was just overjoyed, and so she put it on her altar and she practiced her preliminaries. Well, it said she was doing prostrations, basically. So, but she had such strong faith that on the basis of this, it acted as a condition or a trigger for ripening of her karma, and she achieved a state of realization in that lifetime. And so you can see here that the tooth was nothing special. The blessing came from her having that belief. And so it's very much that way when it comes to these empowerments, etc. And like I say, it can be a mistaken object. But it's better if it's not a mistaken object. If you have faith in somebody who's the real deal, and then you follow them in their practice, there's going to be much more efficacious and there's less dangerous. It's very dangerous to follow a mistaken object. You could have faith in somebody who's got all kinds of weird conduct, and they might just be a charlatan, right? So if you've got faith in somebody and you think, wow, he's so amazing, everything he does turns to gold, you have faith in them, they end up getting screwed if they're just using you. So you have to be careful about that. But anyway, Dusum Khyentse had this, and then Deshin Sherpa, he met the Yongli Emperor. Yongli Emperor made the crown, which is a real thing, and the crown is said to be a representation of what the emperor saw. He said, I saw the details of it, and this is an exact replica. And we basically believe that this crown is imbued with all the powers of the real crown, because of its connection with the teacher. And so when we do the black hat ceremony, many people come, and many people say they benefit from it. I know people who were like in their mother's womb when they did the black hat ceremony, and they've been basically all their lives a really, really sincere practitioner of the Dharma. Don't know if they've achieved awakening, but anyway, it's like I say, it's down to you. So vastly complicated topic, as you can see, and I think I covered just about everything I can regarding that. Otherwise, like I say, it just gets more and more difficult. So we're going to go to the questions from the spreadsheet. So these are questions that are submitted at the link in the description. If you have any questions for this live stream, monthly live stream, please submit them there, because it's a bit difficult me keeping up with everything that's in the chat. And it's kind of a bit too chaotic. So one questioner called Mir from the UK asks about ahimsa. So ahimsa is this non-violence. And it's said that the Buddha Dharma is essentially the conduct of non-violence with the view of emptiness, in the Mahayana Dharma anyway. Or you could say the view of detachment in terms of the Theravada. So ahimsa, non-violence, is the principle that one should not kill or harm living beings, yet coming from the West, a lot of exposure to Buddhism is its violent potential, i.e. Shaolin, Kung Fu, Bushido, warrior monks, and the 969 movement. The 969 movement, I think, is this political movement in Burma that is anti-Muslim. It's really anti-Rohingya Muslim. My question, as someone new to the Buddhism, to how these various combative, militant, Buddhist, negative navigate ahimsa, as well as what exceptions to ahimsa exist, if any, for instance, self-defense. So the thing you have to understand is in the West, we have this impression that basically all Buddhists, monastics, follow this Chinese tradition, essentially, of, for example, Shaolin Kung Fu, and Japanese Bushido warriors, etc. And that's not the case. This is actually a Chinese invention, and it's got nothing to do, really, with original Buddhism. It's not something you will find in Tibet and in the Theravada tradition. Of course, the Buddha taught various things that you should do. For example, if you want to become a monk because you're escaping being signed up to the army, that's not allowed. Because you have a responsibility to protect your homeland. So if your homeland's under threat, and then you suddenly show up at the temple and say, "Oh, I want to become a monk," the Buddha said that's not right. You've got to fulfill your responsibility. But it also says likewise that if you do take monastic vows, then you're not allowed to go off and fight in the army. You have to get rid of your vows first. And for this, then there's a provision. I think it's like you can lose your vows 7 times and go back to them, and that's the maximum. And I think it came about because of this point. And this happened in Tibet, right? So the Chinese invaded Tibet. They suddenly showed up with loads of tanks and airplanes, and the Tibetans, most of them had never even seen an airplane. And thousands of monks they disrobed, and they took up arms to defend their villages, etc. So it does happen. But in general, the Tibetans, they don't study Kung Fu at all. And in the if you look at, there's this guy from the Hillside Hermitage, right? He's like a Slovenian monk. He's quite authentic in terms of Theravada, but you see they all look like they're quite buff. But if you look at most of the monks from Sri Lanka and stuff like that, they're all skinny as rakes. They haven't probably got enough muscle to sort of lift up a shovel even. So they don't train in this. This is something that is associated with the Bodhidharma. So I've talked about this before, but we have who is seen to be historically the founder of the Zen tradition called Bodhidharma, and they say he taught the monks Kung Fu, and it's like an explanation why there are these militant factions in China primarily. From China, this tradition did spread kind of into Japan, but I don't think so. It doesn't exist in Korea really. So we'll talk a little bit about what happened in Japan, maybe, as well. I think that would be interesting. So what you have to understand is that Buddhism came very early to China, something like the 4th century, and middle of the 4th century, with somebody called Kurmajiva, who is like Persian. And then at that time, they had a lot of resistance. And so many of the rulers, like China wasn't like ever really a one big empire. At times one group would control more land than the other, but in general then it was generally like many different factions in China. So a lot of the Buddhists, they experienced repression. And one of the things that happened was that the emperor made a rule that there was no weapons allowed. And this was really to quell uprisings. The biggest problem with China is that about every 100 years there's an uprising. I don't know exactly. In recent times, it's been about every 100 years, but quite frequently there'll be an uprising. What happens is you've got this central Chinese area, which provides all the food and resources for the people who live along the coast. So the wealthy people in China all live along the coast, like Beijing, Shanghai, all these areas. This has been like this for thousands of years. And they use the resources from the inland. So coal, food, trees, etc., all come from the inland. And so the inland people tend to be a bit poor. And because the people on the coast have ships and they have merchant navies, then they have always been really rich. In fact, you see this archaeology that's happened recently in India. At some point, one of these kind of captains from China built this massive ship that is even large on kind of modern standards in some ways, this wooden ship, and they used to trade with India. This is many, many centuries ago. And so there was always this tradition, and the coastal people were very rich, and the inland people were very poor. And so they always had these uprisings. And the other thing is that the Buddhism appealed to the working class. That's really important to understand, because caste is very important in China, and the Buddha refuted caste. So this also was a reason why Buddhism was very strong in India, because there was a lot of people who suffered under the caste system. And Japan is the same, right? The caste system is very strong. So the emperor made this rule, that all weapons were banned. Only his armies could have weapons, and this is a way of controlling the masses who were always uprising. And so what had happened was that many of these working class poor people were Buddhists or were converting to Buddhism, and they developed systems where they could fight without weapons. And so things like used for threshing grain, normal tools, everyday use, then they developed these fighting skills, these martial skills, in order to be able to defend themselves and to defend themselves from oppression, basically. And it got to the point where there were even some wars that were, I mean, there's this debate about this, but for example, there was these kind of wars with the Boxer Revolution and everything. This tradition probably came out from Buddhist groups trying to defend themselves and then having a rebellion. And so there's this real militant history in China associated with Buddhism, but it's got nothing to do with Buddhism. It's got to do with Chinese history, really. And so in the West, we think, well, how can this be? Because there is, Buddha teaches that you should have non-violence, and it seems like they're total pacifists. So getting back to this, then we look at this point about things like self-defense. Well, the Buddha basically, as I said, did say that you had to defend your people, you had to defend, you had responsibilities to your country, and that it was even okay to disrobe as a monk. But as a monk, basically, then if you're really what we call a monk, which doesn't mean like in the West we think of monks as being people who worship God, for example. Being a monk has got nothing to do with that. Being a monk is somebody who's decided that they're going to just give everything up for practice, and they practice to be liberated. So it's a path of personal liberation, and there's actually 3 valid reasons, but in general the authentic one is to give up all worldly life to practice in order to become liberated. And so these people basically understand that they're supposed to give up all attachment, right? Attachment even to good things. It's like you'll see this in the talks from the guy from the Hillside Hermitage, where he says it's even you wouldn't get up to help somebody over there because you're giving up all desire and all attachment. And it is actually a really valid statement in terms of the Theravada. Of course, it's not when we come to the Mahayana Buddhism, but in the Hinayana or the Theravada Buddhism, the Shrakayana, then yes, that is the case. And it's because they want to become liberated as soon as possible. So what it says is, what the Buddha famously said is, even if somebody would take a double-edged sword and one by one cut off your limbs, that if you got angry, you wouldn't be a follower of mine, meaning somebody in my Sangha. And that's because they basically see samsara is there's no gain in samsara, there's zero-sum gain. And the only thing you can do is to get out of it, is to leave. And to leave, you've got to give up all desire for this world. That means everything. Food, your own well-being. So even if somebody comes to cut you up, then you would just sit there and meditate, right? You're not going to fight back. But obviously the Buddha wasn't a fool. And, ideally, this is what the practitioners need to be. But as I said, there's 3 valid reasons for becoming a practitioner. One is seeking protection from fear. So renunciation, you're in samsara, it sucks, you're really poor, you've got no hope of anything in this life, then you can join the monastery in order to be fed and clothed and to get an education, is a valid reason for practicing discipline. That is what it says in the scriptures. That's also the Pali Canon. And then there's seeking higher rebirth. So it means that you do the same so that in the next lifetime you can be born in better circumstances. And so poor, difficult situation, you realize samsara is a terrible situation, it sucks and you want to get out of it, but you don't have what it takes to become liberated, so you will practice virtue, avoid non-harm, etc., in order to be reborn as a human with better resources in the next lifetime. But really the purpose of that is so then you can become an arahat in the next lifetime. And then there's the authentic, the 3 are authentic, but there's the best one, which is to seek personal liberation. And for them, then there's no question of self-defense. Now, however, when we come to the Mahayana, then we see that you can work to protect others. So the person's question says, are there any exceptions? Well, in terms of the Mahayana Dharma, there is a very, very clear indication in the Mahayana Sutras of these kind of exceptions, but they're not what you think. For example, there was this story of the Buddha in a previous lifetime, and he was a bodhisattva. And being a bodhisattva, then he only worked for the benefit of other beings. And at that lifetime, he's said to be like a ship's captain or something. So he's a ship's captain, and he's got this ship full of 500 merchants. And these are merchants who have entered the Bodhisattva path. So they've taken the Bodhisattva vow. That means that they've made this wish to be liberated for the sake of others, not for their own sake, and so to practice the Dharma. And there was somebody who joined the ship who was actually a pirate, so he's in disguise, and he had this plan to murder them all. So he was going to murder them all and steal their wealth, right? And the Buddha, through his clairvoyance or whatever, figured it out and knew that this guy was going to kill these 500 bodhisattvas or potential bodhisattvas, and so the Buddha murdered him. Now, most people think, the Buddha murdered him to protect the 500 merchants. That's completely wrong. That's the exactly wrong way around. The Buddha murdered him, to protect the pirate, because it's extremely negative karma to kill a bodhisattva, somebody on the bodhisattva path. Even to discredit them or insult them is negative. So of course killing them is negative. And the Buddha saw that this pirate would then have to spend countless eons in the hell realms for his misdeed. And so the Buddha killed this pirate for his own benefit. And so that kind of gives you an idea of a very clear exception given in the scriptures for this. And this is the Mahayana, right? And so based on that, the Buddha is said to have been reborn in hell, but the Buddha only spent a very short period in hell. And when he was in hell, because he was a bodhisattva, he gave rise to compassion for the other people suffering there. And as a consequence of that, he was immediately reborn in higher states. In the Theravada, then they say that basically that karma is kind of infallible, and if you do a negative act, it will just only result in negativity. But in the Mahayana, they say if you do a negative act like that, but it is based on good intention, it's actually a very profound way of accumulating positive karma. It says to be eons of positive karma the Buddha accumulated for that, but that doesn't agree with the Pali Canon. So let's look at what it says in the Pali Canon regarding this. Do we have any examples of exceptions? Well, there's in the monastic vows, it tells lots of stories about why there are vows. And for example, there's something called the 5 heinous acts, the 5 terrible sins that you can do. And the first of these is matricide, so killing your own mother. And so it says, of course, this is really bad. And if somebody commits matricide, cannot become an arahat, but they also aren't allowed to become a monk. And so, but it tells an exception in the scriptures. In the scriptures, very good. They're not as static and rigid as people think. They have provisions and exceptions. It's hard to translate these words, but there's specific things where the Buddha was asked for permission, and there's also exceptions that the Buddha gave, sort of preempting potential situations. So this story comes in the Vinaya, and it's about a monk who has a mother who's very ill. It's like my mom, you can probably hear her right now, she's screaming in the background. She's really sick, she's got dementia, and she's probably on her last legs at the moment. She's probably in the process of dying. And so this monk has this mother, and she's suffering greatly, in great pain. And he knows that it's very negative to kill your own mother. But the monk kills his mother out of sympathy, knowing that ultimately killing her isn't going to help her situation, because we need to see out our karma in order to mature it. But because of seeing the such intense suffering she was going through, then he wanted to put her out of her misery, and so he killed his mother. And this is an example given in the scriptures, and it kind of says that it's still negative, but doesn't fall into this category of being a totally heinous act. There's still negativity associated with it, but it's kind of permissible in terms of it doesn't equate to like murder or murdering your mother. So you can see that in the scriptures there are exceptions given, and there's actually loads of stories in the Vinaya. Most people think in the West that it's like not worth reading the Vinaya anymore. It's just about monastic discipline. There's no point. But if you look, all the rules, they weren't just given preemptively. The rules in the Vinaya all arose out of actual situations, and what it does is it actually explains the story of why the vow came about. For example, the women have a vow where they're not allowed to throw shit around in the park. And you're like, why the hell is there this vow? Or there's a vow for the men where you're not allowed to pee standing up. And it's because something particular happened at a particular time. There was once with this group of nuns, and some lay people were coming near to them, and they were trying to practice, and the lay people were having like some sort of wedding ceremony or something like that, and it was distracting them. So they threw shit. They took their feces and they spread it around to stop the lay people from coming close. And the Buddha said, well, you're not allowed to do that, right? Because you're going to give the monastics a bad name. So there's like a reason for all of these. There's a reason for all of these things in the Vinaya, and so it's worth reading. It's quite hard going. It's huge text with huge commentaries, but it's interesting to know exactly the reasons why these things exist. And they don't exist for no reason whatsoever. They're all based in kind of logic. For example, why do the monks wear robes? Well, the monks are given these robes to differentiate them from ordinary lay people. And the reason why that is because in the past, a king or a lord wanted to make offerings to the Sangha, and he couldn't tell the difference between Hindu practitioners and Buddhist practitioners. And he was trying to accumulate the merit that's associated with giving food to the Buddhist followers. And he said, could you kind of help me out here? Because they kind of look the same to me, right? They're all a bit scruffy. Can you please make some sort of system? And so then the Buddha said, okay, well, you should wear this particular color. Why did they choose that color? Because it's the color of fabric that they used to wrap dead bodies in the cemetery, so nobody would normally wear that, for example. So there's reasons for everything. And then he said, what pattern should it be? Because they weren't allowed to have long pieces of cloth, because long pieces of cloth in those days still are worth money, right? And so they had to have little patches. They weren't allowed to have little pieces of cloth up to a certain size, because they were of basically no value, and they were scraps, basically. And so he said, well, you can take these scraps and you can make them like the pattern in those fields over there. That's what he did. He looked and he saw the fields of rice, and they're all like one here, one here, one here. And he said, that will do. So you see, there's reason for all of this. Anyway, I've gone on, and we've only got through one question from the spreadsheet, but I hope that has been of some benefit for you. We'll leave it there for today. Please submit your questions to the spreadsheet. Mary will give you the details of that. It's also in the description of the live stream. Thank you for joining me. Also, any merit that we've accumulated from getting together and discussing the Dharma, then I think we should offer that for the benefit of all sentient beings to be something productive and useful, and that will lead to the betterment of existence and liberation of all. So until next time, then see you later.